Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be exploring DynCorp. And you've given us quite a stack of sources on them, Reddit comments, a Wikipedia entry, some pretty hard-hitting investigative journalism pieces, and even a website that, well, let's just say isn't exactly singing their praises.
It certainly seems like we'll be getting a multifaceted view of this company.
Exactly. And what's really caught my eye already is the sheer range of what DynCorp does. I mean, we're talking everything from training police forces in war-torn countries to, get this, maintaining swimming pools for the U.S. military in Iraq. So to help us unpack all of this, we have an expert in government contracting and corporate practices joining us.
Glad to be here. DynCorp is a company that really embodies the complexities of this industry.
Okay, so before we get to the controversies, let's start with the basics. DynCorp hasn't always been this sprawling global operation, right?
You're absolutely right. They started back in 1946 as California Eastern Airways, primarily focused on air freight. It's quite a journey from hauling cargo to say. Providing security for a head of state like Hamid Karzai.
Talk about a career change. But I guess even in those early days, there were hints of their future involvement with the government.
Absolutely. They were involved in airlifting supplies during the Korean War and even played a role at the White Sands Missile Range. These early government contracts were really a stepping stone.
And from there, they kind of went on a corporate shopping spree, right? Acquiring company after company.
It's a classic strategy in this industry. They went through several name changes, first Dynelectron, then finally DynCorp in 1987, absorbing more companies and expanding their reach with each merger. Eventually, they transformed from an aviation company into this massive conglomerate involved in everything from energy and IT to, of course, defense.
So instead of sticking to one lane, they became a jack of all trades, ready to capitalize on whatever opportunity or conflict came their way.
That's a pretty apt way to put it. This kind of diversification allows companies like DynCorp to be incredibly adaptable. When demand for one service dries up, they have a whole menu of others to offer.
Which brings us to the U.S. government, their biggest client by far. Over 96% of DynCorp's revenue, which totals a staggering $3 billion annually, comes from government contracts.
That's right. And that figure alone tells you a lot about the scale of private military contracting today. It's become a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Billions of dollars. It's almost mind-boggling. So where exactly are they spending all this money? What does DynCorp actually do for the government around the world?
Well, their operations are truly global. They've worked in post-conflict zones like Bosnia, Somalia, and Haiti. Even domestically, they were involved in the post-Hurricane Katrina cleanup in Louisiana. But perhaps their most significant roles have been in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, and from what we saw in the sources, their involvement in those conflicts was quite extensive. They were guarding Hamid Karzai, training Afghan and Iraqi police forces, even supporting counter-narcotics efforts.
What's fascinating here is that DynCorp's story in Iraq and Afghanistan really highlights a larger trend. The increasing reliance on private military contractors in warfare. We're talking about tasks traditionally carried out by soldiers now being outsourced to private companies.
Which has to raise some eyebrows when it comes to accountability, right? I mean, if private companies are essentially performing military functions, who's really in control? What rules are they following?
Those are definitely some of the questions we need to grapple with as we delve deeper into DynCorp's activities. But even beyond security and military support, you'll find they have a finger in a surprising number of pies. They're involved in air operations, intelligence training, even development work in Africa and Latin America.
So they're not just about war, they're about peace building too.
Precisely. They position themselves to profit from both war and peace, adapting to whatever the political climate demands.
Which is a pretty savvy business strategy, if a bit unsettling when you think about it.
It certainly raises questions about the motivations behind their work. Is it purely about profit? Or are there genuine humanitarian impulses at play?
I guess that's something we'll be exploring throughout this deep dive. Speaking of unsettling, one area where DynCorp has been particularly active and controversial is the war on drugs, specifically their role in Plan Colombia.
Yes, their activities in Colombia, particularly their aerial spraying of herbicides, are a prime example of how DynCorp's work blurs the lines between fighting drugs and, well, potentially causing harm.
Right. We saw in one of the investigative articles that they've been accused of using incredibly potent herbicides, the effects of which are still being debated.
And the consequences aren't just limited to the drug crops themselves. There have been allegations of harm to farmers, ecosystems, and even unintended casualties like the missionary plane that was shot down in Peru, potentially mistaken for a drug trafficking aircraft.
That incident really highlights the dangerous environment in which DynCorp operates. and the potential for tragic unintended consequences.
And it begs the question, who's really benefiting from these interventions? Is it about eradicating narcotics? Or are there other agendas at play?
Which leads us to another side of DynCorp that you brought up earlier, a much darker side. We're talking about allegations of misconduct, financial impropriety, even sex trafficking.
These accusations are incredibly serious and can't be ignored. They point to a potential underbelly of the private military industry that we need to examine closely.
One of the sources, an article titled Dirty Tricks, Inc., was particularly disturbing. It claimed that DynCorp was using Promise software to cover up government fraud, and that's not even touching on the horrific allegations of sex trafficking in Bosnia.
The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, or SIGIR, did find evidence of unauthorized billing and mismanagement of funds in Iraq. As for the Bosnia allegations, we have whistleblowers like Ben Johnson and Catherine Bolkovac who risked their careers to expose what they witnessed.
Their stories are truly chilling. Johnston claimed he saw DynCorp employees buying and selling women, some as young as 12 years old. He tried to report it, but he was fired and ended up needing protection from the U.S. Army.
And Bolkovac's experience was so impactful that it was even turned into a film, The Whistleblower.
It's a stark reminder that when you have private companies operating in these often lawless environments, the potential for abuse is huge.
Especially when those companies are essentially unaccountable to anyone but their shareholders.
It seems like oversight is a recurring issue with DynCorp, and with private military contractors in general.
Absolutely. The question of oversight, or the lack thereof, is something we need to consider carefully. After all, if we're outsourcing war, shouldn't we be extra vigilant about who we're outsourcing it to and how they're behaving?
That's a great point. And it leads us to the bigger question looming over all of this. Is it even ethical to have companies profiting from war?
Now that's the heart of the matter, isn't it?
Oh.
It's a question with no easy answers.
On one hand, you could argue that private contractors like DynCorp provide services that the government can't or won't. Maybe they're more cost-effective, more flexible, or have specialized expertise.
There's definitely an argument to be made for their efficiency and expertise. But on the other hand, as we've seen, there's also a very real risk of abuse, lack of transparency, and a blurring of the lines between military and corporate interests.
Not to mention the moral implications of essentially outsourcing war and peace to the highest bidder.
You've hit the nail on the head. If we're handing over such crucial functions to private companies, we need to ask ourselves, are we also handing over our moral compass?
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface, and yet we've already uncovered so much about DynCorp's sprawling operations and the ethical quandaries they raise.
And we haven't even touched upon their deep involvement in government IT systems yet. That's another aspect of their work that warrants a closer look.
Oh, right. One of the articles mentioned they were managing databases for agencies like the FBI, the DEA, even the SEC. That's some pretty sensitive information to be entrusted to a private company, don't you think?
It's certainly thought-provoking. Imagine a private company having access to the very data that those agencies use to regulate them. It raises questions about potential conflicts of interest and the security of that information.
It does seem a little like the fox guarding the hen house, doesn't it?
That's one way to put it. And that article you mentioned went even further, suggesting that DynCorp might have used this access to manipulate data, potentially covering up government fraud. They even brought up Promise software again in this context.
Promise, that's the controversial software we discussed earlier. The one that was allegedly used for all sorts of shady activities.
Exactly. Now, I'm not saying DynCorp was definitely involved in anything illegal, but the possibility is certainly worth considering, especially given their track record and the lack of transparency we've already discussed.
It seems like the further we go down this rabbit hole, the more questions we have about oversight and accountability.
That's the thing about these large government contractors. They often operate in a kind of gray zone, where the lines between public and private interests become blurred. And it becomes very difficult to determine who's ultimately responsible when things go wrong.
We've been talking about DynCorp in the context of these high-stakes, often life-or-death situations, but there was one image from our sources that's really stuck with me. It was that photograph from the Reddit thread showing a DynCorp contractor walking through an opium field in Afghanistan.
I remember that photo. It's quite striking, wasn't it? The vibrant red poppies contrasting with the contractor's military gear. It really encapsulates the complex and often contradictory nature of DynCorp's work.
It's almost surreal. Here's this American contractor surrounded by these beautiful flowers, which are also the source of so much misery and conflict.
It speaks to DynCorp's multifaceted role in the war on drugs. On the one hand, they're involved in eradication efforts like the aerial spraying we talked about earlier. On the other, they're providing security in regions where drug production is rampant.
And someone in the Reddit comments had posted a poem alongside that photo. It went, on the grass of the cliff, at the edge of the steep, God planted a garden of sleep. It was about these poppies, how they're both beautiful and deadly.
A fitting metaphor for DynCorp itself, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. This company that operates in these dangerous, morally ambiguous environments, profiting from conflict while also claiming to be promoting peace. It's almost like they've mastered the art of having it both ways.
And that's precisely the challenge, isn't it? How do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory roles? How do we hold companies like DynCorp accountable for their actions when they operate in these murky gray zones?
And with DynCorp now operating as a subsidiary of Momentum, a much larger government contractor, one has to wonder if these questions are becoming even more difficult to answer.
It certainly raises concerns about whether DynCorp's past practices and the issues we've discussed will simply be absorbed into this larger entity, making them even harder to track and scrutinize.
We've been focusing on DynCorp specifically, but this brings us to a much bigger question about private military contractors in general.
You're right. This isn't just a DynCorp story. This is about the increasing privatization of war and the implications for democracy, accountability, and even our basic moral compass.
And that's a conversation that needs to happen on a much wider scale, because ultimately it's not just about one company. It's about the choices we make as a society.
Exactly. Do we want to live in a world where war is outsourced to the highest bidder, with little oversight or accountability? Or do we want to demand more transparency, ethical behavior, and responsible governance from both governments and the companies they contract?
That's a powerful question to leave our listener with. But before we get too deep into that philosophical territory, I'm curious, what do you think is the most surprising or unexpected thing we've learned about DynCorp so far?
I think for me, it's the sheer breadth of their involvement. We knew they were a major player in the private military industry, but I don't think either of us fully grasped the extent of their reach. They're involved in everything from training police forces to managing sensitive government databases.
And let's not forget about maintaining those swimming pools in Iraq. It's almost comical when you juxtapose it with the more serious, even disturbing aspects of their work.
It's that juxtaposition that I find so fascinating and, frankly, unsettling. It speaks to the complex reality of these companies, the fact that they can be both mundane and deeply problematic at the same time.
And that brings us back to that Reddit comment that really struck a chord with me earlier, the one about the poppy fields. The commenter said, farms that can sustain so many flowers can also sustain food crops.
Ah, yes. That simple statement that packs such a powerful punch.
It made me think about the choices we make as a society, about the priorities we set. Here we have these fields in Afghanistan capable of producing food, yet they're being used to cultivate opium, a crop that fuels addiction and conflict.
It's a reminder that we live in a world of interconnected systems, where the choices made in one place can have ripple effects across the globe. And DynCorp, in many ways, is a microcosm of that interconnectedness.
Their activities touch upon so many critical issues: war, peace, development, human rights, the environment. It's like they're a thread woven through the very fabric of global affairs, connecting seemingly disparate events and actors in unexpected and often unsettling ways.
And I think that's the key takeaway from our deep dive into DynCorp. It's not just about one company. It's about understanding the complexities of the systems we live in and the far-reaching consequences of our actions, both individual and collective.
So if we're thinking about this from our listeners' perspective, what can they do with this information? It can feel overwhelming to confront these big systemic issues.
You're absolutely right. It can be paralyzing to think about these global problems. But I think the first step, as always, is awareness. Understanding the role of private military contractors, the ethical challenges they present, and the impact their activities have on the world is crucial.
And maybe, just maybe, that awareness can lead to more informed choices. Whether it's supporting businesses that align with our values, engaging in constructive dialogue about government contracting, or simply being more conscious of the consequences of our actions. It all comes back to that idea of individual responsibility, doesn't it? If we want to see change in the world, we have to start by examining our own choices and actions.
Absolutely. We can't simply sit back and say, well, that's just how the world works. We have a responsibility to engage with these issues, to ask tough questions, and to demand better from those in power.
It's like that quote, The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Exactly. Silence and apathy are the greatest enablers of injustice.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with what seemed like a straightforward question: what does DynCorp do? And ended up in this complex web of global politics, corporate power, and ethical dilemmas.
And I think that's the beauty of these deep dives. They allow us to peel back the layers of seemingly simple questions and reveal the intricate connections that shape our world.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls. You open one and there's another one inside and another and another.
A perfect analogy. And with each layer we uncover, we gain a deeper understanding not just of the specific topic at hand, but of the larger forces at play.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into DynCorp, what's the one thing you hope our listener will take away from this conversation?
I hope they'll walk away with a sense of informed curiosity. DynCorp's story is just one example of how private companies are increasingly wielding influence in areas that were traditionally the domain of governments. I hope this deep dive has sparked a desire to learn more about these trends, to ask questions, and to engage in critical thinking about the role of corporations in our world.
Well said. It's been an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And to you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of DynCorp. We hope it's given you some new insights and, as our expert said, sparked a desire to learn more. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking the tough questions.